The title of today's message is Work, Economics, and Government. You think that might be a little ambitious to speak about three big things like this. What I'd like to try to do is hit each one of them very briefly, and then particularly the last half of the message, what is the interplay of that supposed to be? How does the Bible look at work, economics, and government? And that's what we're trying to do. Now, when I think about work, one of the things that always comes to my mind is my work history. My first job was paper boy for the Denver Post in junior high, and I learned a lot about work as a junior hire. The people that I was delivering the paper to were very persnickety about getting their Denver Post in the evenings and their Sunday morning Denver Post nice and early. It's one thing to throw the newspaper in the fall and the spring, but it's another thing when there's an ice storm or in the heat. My next job was in high school, and I worked at what my generation would have called a malt shop or a diner, but it was really, really small. It was a part of a drugstore, and the drugstore had a small kitchen and a small area where people could come, and they could eat lunch or they could eat dinner or snacks, and it was a one-person operation. They hired me, and what I realized after a few days was that my job description included these items. I was the waiter, and the busboy, and the dishwasher guy, and the cook. I was the cook. Now, which tells me that their hiring practices were not very thorough back then. But my job was to be there at 3:30 as soon as school was over, and I was to have everything ready to go. I made hamburgers and cheeseburgers and chili dogs and malts and floats and hot apple turnovers, and I learned a lot about work at that job. One of the things I learned was that if I didn't do a good job, I was not going to have a job because it all fell upon me. If the diner did not do well financially, I also would not have a job. And so that provided some extra incentive in terms of the type of work I did, the quality of work, and the attitude I had with people. Now, I have to tell you that my skills as a cook, I should have read the tea leaves sooner. Because in my 9 months of having that particular job, the total amount of tips that I received in 9 months was a nickel. 5 cents of tip. And I had the impression from where the placement of the nickel was on this particular table that it wasn't really a tip. It was just sort of one piece of change that got away from them, sort of behind the salt and pepper shaker. That should have told me something. Now, over the years, work, if you think back in our history of America, work used to be, we had a very strong, what we used to call a Puritan work ethic, where work had a high value, and it was important to do that work, and it was a sacred responsibility, no matter what your work is. Now, the pendulum has swung, not just in America, but in Western civilization, way over to this side. Now, depending on who you talk to, and this may be very, you may have people at work, or you may have uttered some of these words, like work is a necessary evil, or TGIF, it's like we're just waiting for Friday to finally get here, or the proliferation of paid time off, which I always think is kind of funny because that money comes from somewhere. It doesn't just magically appear out of nowhere. And then things like the latest thing is the living wage. The living wage. You should be able to make enough money at whatever job you have that you be able to support yourself and your family. Now, if living wage had been a part of the land back when I started, I would not have had either of my first two jobs. I doubt I would have had my third job because I don't think any of those employers would have been able to afford me at a living wage for what I do. Now, when I think about what does the Bible say about economics, in the shortest way I can say this, I will say this: responsibility pays, and irresponsibility doesn't pay. Irresponsibility means that you probably are going to be updating your resume quite often and doing a lot of job searches. So let's look at work and economics first. In Genesis 1, we have what theologians call the cultural mandate. And it seems like I've been reading the same passage through this whole series on Worldview. You know, maybe we can memorize it. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." God said, "I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, all the birds of the air, the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food," and it was so. Now, this was spoken just to Adam and Eve, but what he's not saying to them is, okay, there's a farming aspect here, and there's sort of a zookeeper aspect here with the beasts and getting them. What God is saying is something very big, that you are going to have to work at making civilization happen. When it's just a few families out in the bush somewhere, you can there's not a lot of complexity to it. But you put millions of people in the same country and trying to live on a bush mentality, there's a lot of chaos that's going to happen. This is what's called the cultural mandate. When I was a young Christian at age 20, and I started going to church, first time I'd been to a Bible teaching church, I was mesmerized by our particular pastor. He was a little Scottish guy with a very thick Scottish brogue. "Please turn in your Bibles to the book of Jeremiah." And I was just fascinated by this. And I remember thinking, wow, what would it be like to be a pastor? And just sort of studying and teaching and talking to people. But I remember back then, I mistakenly thought that work was divided up into two categories, the spiritual and the secular. Well, there's no such thing in the Bible on that. All work is sacred, and it finds its roots right here in this passage that we just read. Notice that this cultural mandate and that work is sacred happened before sin and before the world fell. Now, in terms of work, everybody makes errors in one of two directions on work. Either we make too much of work, or we make too little of work. We maximize it or minimize it. So on the maximize side, this is where people like my father became a workaholic. And sometimes that has to do with necessity of finances. That was not the case of my dad. But it was the belief that this is the place where I can find fulfillment, and I can use my passions and gifts, and I can make a difference in the world. And the tendency when that happens, if work gets too high a priority in my heart, then what ends up happening is the Ecclesiastes experience, where King Solomon had everything at his disposal to make life work, and all the different kinds of works projects that he did. And yet, even though they promised to bring fulfillment, the book of Ecclesiastes tells a very different story. In your handout, he starts out with, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher," this is Solomon, "utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless." The word means either empty or vanity, like there's nothing to it. "What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun?" If I maximize work, make too much of it, then I'm going to find work extremely disappointing and frustrating. On the other hand, we can minimize work, like I mentioned at the beginning of the message, and that's also a mistake. In 2 Thessalonians 3:8, Paul tells the folks who, some of them were making this mistake of minimizing work. He reminded them that when he was there in Thessalonica, "Nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling." It's hardly just clocking in and clocking out. "So that we may not be a burden to any of you. We did this not because we do not have the right to such help." In other words, he was starting a church and he was ministering there, and he could have done what in our day and time, you raise support, have other people that fund you so you can get started until the church becomes self-supporting. He could have done that, he said. Not because we didn't have the right to help, but in order to make ourselves a model for you to follow. And here he's describing that his work standards, his work diligence was a sermon in and of itself to the people. To give you a model for you to follow, for even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. If a man will not work, he shall not eat. We hear that some among you are idle. They are not busy, they are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the bread that they eat. Now, either way is a mistake. To maximize work, to think there's more to it that can satisfy the soul, or to just put our time in. On the inside of your handout, I like to talk about work and what we used to call the work ethic. Imagine that you just finished grad school or college and you're looking out for your first job. And you think, what comes to your mind? What came to your imagination when perhaps you think about the corner office that you're going to have and the big desk and your name on your desk and maybe on your particular office door. And you think about that you're going to have a secretary and an assistant, and you're going to have these big-time lunches and things. It's easy to be idealistic. I was certainly idealistic when I got out of grad school about work. What often happens is that you find out that work is named work for a reason. It's work. Instead of the corner office, you may have a little cubby hole. Instead of being able to look on the nice landscape outside of your window, you may be able to look at your calendar in front of you. Instead of just clocking in and clocking out, you may have the experience of some of our kids who have been through our church and are now out in the work world in their first job. Instead of working 8 hours a day, work 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day. And instead of 5 days a week, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. And instead of their passions being used like they want to, they are grunting through a lot of work that has to get done. Now, when that happens, it's very easy to become disillusioned about work. And what Proverbs says is don't do that. That's a mistake. And so I'd like to go through, what does Proverbs say when it talks about economics? The first is work your land versus chasing fantasies. Work your land versus chasing fantasies. Proverbs 16:26. The laborer's appetite works for him. His hunger drives him on. Now, what he says here is the number one incentive about work is you want to eat. That's important. And we'll come to more of this as we get into the message. Number 2, Proverbs 28:19. He who works his land will have abundant food, but the one who chases fantasies will have his fill of poverty. Now, what does he mean, chasing fantasies? When I think about this, there's one kind of fantasy that has to do with get rich quick schemes and gambling and betting and the like. There's another kind of fantasy that's sort of lived out by, I can just clock in and clock out, and I'll still get my paycheck, and I'll probably get that promotion if I just am nicer around the workplace. Both of these things are not substitutes for what he says. He who works his land will have abundant food. Proverbs 14:23. All hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. And when I think about this thing of mere talk, what I think about is excuse making. Excuse making. Excuse making is a recipe, as Proverbs says, for poverty. Work your land. Number 2, diligence versus laziness. Proverbs 10:4. Lazy hands make a man poor. Now, I like to claim biblical promises for myself. This is not a biblical promise that many of us are claiming for ourselves. Lord, I'm going to be lazy, so please help me be poor. But diligent hands bring wealth. He who gathers crops in summer is a wise son. He who sleeps during harvest is a disgraceful son. Here is the second lowest on the totem pole incentive. The first one is so I can eat. The next one up is to stay out of the poorhouse, as Proverbs says. Number 3, handle your responsibilities versus being driven by your feelings. Or when I think about driven by your feelings, a lot of us have jobs where some of the things we like to do, some of the things we don't like to do. Some of the things motivate us and some of the things demotivate us. And what Proverbs tells you is that that may be true, but you cannot let that determine your work ethic. 1 Thessalonians 4:11, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, mind your own business, to work with your hands just as we told you, so that your daily life, now here what he equates with your daily life is your work, the previous line, so that your daily life will win the respect of outsiders, those who don't yet know Christ. This is one of the things that I envy about people that don't have a job like mine, is that you, for 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week, you are rubbing shoulders with people in the work world, and they have a chance to see your attitudes about work and how diligently you work. And what Paul says here in Thessalonians is, that speaks loudly. That's a testimony to win the respect of outsiders so that you will not be dependent on anybody. So here I think about incentive number 3 is being self-sufficient, being not dependent, and at the same time making a difference. Number 4, industry versus small compromises. Proverbs 6:6, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways, without having any chief, officer, or ruler, without anybody looking over their shoulder, or the boss walking by and having suddenly to look like you're busy. She prepares her food in summer and gathers her sustenance in harvest. And then I love the application that he makes here from the lesson of the ant. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? Now, you may think, if you've raised teenagers, that maybe this particular comes to mind. When I was swimming the other morning up at Irvine High School, 6 a.m., the lady that was in the next lane to me had to pause after about 15 minutes to go get on her phone to make sure her son woke up for his swim meet. So I waited until she got back, and we continued on the work there. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? It's like, one of the great philosophical questions, when will you arise? And then a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. And poverty will come upon you like a vagabond, and want or scarcity like an armed man. Somebody that came into your home and just stole you blind, is what he equates. These small little compromises, a little sleep, a little slumber. I just take a little bit longer lunch break, a little bit longer coffee break. I need to go home a little bit earlier today. All of these things are bad ideas. Number 5, wholehearted versus the grudging attitude. Whatever you do, Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Throw yourself into it. You don't have to feel like working hard to actually work hard. You don't have to feel like your heart's in it to actually put your heart into it. You are working for the Lord and not men, since you know you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Incentive number 5 is you're not just rewarded by a paycheck or your benefits, but the Lord rewards you. Incentive number 5, by your work ethic and attitude. And number 6, you are working for Jesus Christ. Planning and thoroughness versus haste. Proverbs 21:5, the plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. As surely as haste leads to poverty. And number 7, honesty versus dishonesty. Proverbs 21:6, a fortune made by a lying tongue is a fleeting vapor and a deadly snare. This speaks for itself. Now, how does work and economics and the government relate together? And I really just wanted to talk about 2 particular principles. If you missed our message on government, that was message 3 in the series. You can go back on our website and get a much fuller account of what government is supposed to do. The first thing, government, work, and the economy, there's danger. There are dangers that we need to be aware of. I'm intrigued by 1 Samuel chapter 8. The people had been in bondage in Egypt 400 years. They had been delivered out of bondage. They'd gone around and came into the promised land, and they were in the promised land, and God was their king. They had no king. But they looked around and they said, how come we don't have a king? We want a human king. And the prophet Samuel says, no. That's a terrible idea. And they said, well, we want a king to lead us in battle like all these other nations have. And I guess they forgot that God had been their king and led them in battle. And the central part of taking the promised land, the northern battles and the southern battles, and there they were. They had their land. But the people were insistent, we want a king. And Samuel goes to God and says they don't know what they're saying. They don't know what they're asking. What should I tell them? And God says, it's an idiot idea. This is a paraphrase on my part. It's an idiot idea, but I'm going to let this happen. And sometimes, God gives us that freedom to make idiot ideas and have to pay the price for that. And so we pick up the story in 1 Samuel 8:9, and listen to what God says to Samuel. Listen to them, to the people, but warn them solemnly. And let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. Now, it's my opinion that this was going to be true of King Saul, but it's also a metaphor for what every government official and politician is tempted to do when they have the seat of power, whether it's president, senator, House of Representatives, governor, assembly, legislature, county officials, city officials. The nature of government is at work. Verse 10, Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people. This is not just Samuel's big ideas here. Told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to the commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. To reap his harvest. Not their harvest. His harvest. Whose ground? His ground, not your ground. And still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your menservants and maidservants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. Now, what he's warning here, I think, goes back to our message on human nature, which was message number 2 in this series, and government related in message number 3. And the words that strike me in this story and in history and in the messages we looked at before is government has a vested interest in making itself bigger. It has a vested interest because of our human nature of wanting to have more power, to be in more control of its citizens than it is, and of taking from its citizens more than it needs or should particularly take. Now, that is always in play because of our human nature. The danger is, what should we do? How should we think about this? Now, work, economy, and government are not 3 silos that are unrelated to one another. And government has an effect on both work and the economy in general, and economics, meaning your economics in particular. Government can either make your work and economics better, or it can help make it harder, easier to be able to provide for your family and yourself, to work your stewardship, as Genesis 1 says, or it can make it harder. And over the course of our history and over the course of world history, governments fluctuate on this scale. Sometimes they make work and economics easier to do, and sometimes they make it harder. Let me give you some examples that I think relate to our particular, during this season of, my generation and our generation, the things that are in play on this government scale. One is regulations. Now, regulations by themselves are not bad. They're not bad in and of themselves because of our human nature. Because there will be people that will cheat and cut corners and do things they shouldn't do. And so there is a place for regulations. There's a place for regulations. The danger is that we make regulations so numerous that it becomes onerous for business and work and for your finances, your family finances at home. Years ago, I was watching C-SPAN. I was watching a hearing, and there was a congressman from the Northeast, and he was testifying before his committee, or one of the committees, about his experience. He and his wife wanted to buy a bed and breakfast up in quaint New England, out in the countryside. And they imagined and they dreamt about people driving to their bed and breakfast and seeing the change of the autumn leaves and enjoying the fall season there, or some who would come in the winter and the snow, some who would come in the springtime. They imagined about having guests drive up in their car and feeding them breakfast and talking to them about the village that they could go see. And what he testified to was that eventually they had to sell their bed and breakfast. And they were asked, why did you have to sell your bed and breakfast? And he said, the regulations that we had to go through and the red tape that we had to go through and the government fees that we had to pay and the taxes were so onerous, we could not make a profit and stay in business. We could not pay the mortgage and the expenses for a bed and breakfast. I remember thinking, I think I've just witnessed a miracle where a government official actually admitted to these truths. A second item is taxes. Either taxes can make business easier and work easier, or they can make it more onerous. Jesus says there's a place for taxes. Give to Caesar what is Caesar, to man what is man. The Bible does not say that taxes are bad or that taxes are good. Taxes are what they are. But government can either make this easier or more difficult. Yesterday, I filled up my Toyota 4Runner with gas. I don't know if I filled it up. I put 12 gallons of gas in it. While I was filling up my gas tank, I looked down at the little sticker there at the Shell station, and I looked and it said, California gas tax was over 50 cents per gallon. 50 cents a gallon, over. And the U.S. gas tax was 18 cents per gallon. And then it said something like local, and there was no figure there. I guess that was up for, whatever you want, wherever you live. But I thought, wow, so every gallon of gas I'm putting in my car right now, 68 cents is flying either off to Sacramento or Washington, D.C. I put $39 worth of gas in my car, and I think at least $6 was not in my car. It was on its way to Sacramento and Washington, D.C. Now, it's kind of odd when you think about this because, as you all know, gas taxes out here in California have declined. I wonder if the gas taxes have also declined in a commensurate way. Number 3, the minimum wage. This is being fiercely debated across the nation from New England to Seattle and Portland. The minimum wage. Some people advocate a $15 minimum wage and they call it a living wage. Every job should have the guarantee of a living wage. And as I mentioned to you, if that was the case back when I started out, I would not have been a paper boy and I would not have had a job at that drugstore. I doubt if even my third job they would have paid me a living wage. When I think about this, I think that on a minimum wage, it's not enough to have good intentions about what this will do, or to be caring and concerning about the people who have entry-level jobs. Intentions are important. But in addition to intentions, does the policy actually help the people in their work environment? When I think about this, there was a restaurant in San Francisco back in 2012 called AQ. Some of you food people may know about this. And it was, in 2012, it was nominated the James Beard Award finalist for Best New Restaurant in America, AQ. In 2012, its profit margin was 8.5%, which for a restaurant is very good. But being in San Francisco, and with all the regulations and taxes, the government mandates, in 3 years, their profit margin went from 8.5% to 1.5%, and AQ, who in 2012 had been a finalist for one of the best restaurants in America, had to close its doors. It's not enough just that we are compassionate about and our intentions to want to help people, but we also have to look at outcomes. There was a fellow in New York named Jeremy Marin who had 5 Cuban restaurants. And as his cost of business have gone up because of red tape and regulations and wage salaries and scale, he had to close 2 of his 5 Cuban restaurants. Now, what happens to all those employees that used to work at those 2 Cuban restaurants? Where do they go? A Harvard study a few years ago said that if for every $1 that a minimum wage is increased for the workers at a restaurant, for every $1 an hour increase, there is between a 4 and 10% likelihood of this restaurant closing. If you add from $7.50 an hour up to $15 an hour, you can do the math on that yourself. And then benefits is the 4th thing. Government mandated benefits for employees, for their employees. When I think about this, I am sort of dumbfounded that my son and my son-in-law have actually had paid time off as a father. That's pretty astounding to me. I mean, you know, there was no such thing when I became a father. And I think about, well, that money comes from somewhere. The company doesn't just print, the companies just don't print up money and say, here's your paid time off. It comes from somewhere. It just doesn't appear. And so these kind of things, although they are a benefit, it also comes with a cost to business about employing. Now, one of the best illustrations that I watched on an interview years ago, somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, there was a business strategist for Carl's Jr. who was being interviewed about the prospects for the next year for Carl's Jr. and their also companies, Hardee's, back in the South. And what was the business plan of expansion for the next year? And the man, the journalist asked, and the strategist said, our plan is to open up 200 stores next year. Then this journalist was from California. He's kind of like, well, that's cool. More Carl's Jr. and more, out here in California. And he said, well, how many are going to be here in California? And he said, none. And I remember the journalist just being dumbfounded by that answer. He said, well, where are they going to be? He said, they're all going to be in Texas. He said, well, why is that? And he gave 3 reasons. Trying to open up a store here in California takes 6 months longer than it does in Texas. Why is that? Because of red tape, regulations, and all the permits that have to be signed from the state and the local county and the city. It takes on average 6 months. And while that 6 months is going on, we are paying people to get this store open without any income coming in to support that store yet. That's a drain on business. The second reason that he mentioned was that it takes on average an extra $50,000 per store to build a Carl's Jr. an extra $50,000. He said, well, why is that? He said, it's mostly because of red tape, regulations, and all the costly fees that we have to pay out here in California that you don't have to pay in Texas. $50,000. And the third, and this was the most intriguing to me, was labor laws. In California at the time, what he told the journalist was that California labor law required all of their employees, now think about this, that work the lunch shift or the dinner shift or the afternoon, to have a 2-hour work block, 15-minute break, 2-hour work block, 1 hour lunch, 2-hour break, work, 15-minute break, 2-hour work time. And that these were, if you did not follow those labor laws, businesses could get fined. Now, that was the good intention there was not to overburden employees working at in this case, fast food restaurants. He said, but some of their stores had gotten fined by the state of California. And so what they had to do was there were days where the people were coming in to get their lunch at a fast food restaurant expecting fast food service, and we had employees sitting back behind the kitchen who could not work. Either government can make business easier or it can make it more difficult. And then the last thing on the back of your handout, work, economy, and government, and what is needed is wisdom. What's needed is wisdom. Now, our government, our Constitution, says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. This is a pretty good, I read this because it's a pretty good summary of what government is supposed to do from a biblical point of view. It's kind of like, wow, these guys, they did their homework. They did their Bible study and came up with this. And what government is supposed to do, as we looked at a few weeks ago, is to make it easier for each of us to take care of our responsibilities and our stewardships. It can either make it easier or it can make it more difficult. When King Solomon followed his own father, King David, into the kingship, this was his prayer. Give me now wisdom. He said, God, give me wisdom and knowledge to go out and come in before this people, for who can rule this people that is so great? I don't have what it takes to do this. What I need is wisdom. And what I need is knowledge. And then what Proverbs calls understanding. You who are simple gain prudence. You who are foolish gain understanding. I mention this because, and I just want to speak personally here. When I was a young adult, this is back in the 70s, I was just getting married. I had just graduated from seminary, and Mindy was coming up, finished a year before finished, and then we got married. And we were starting out, I was painting houses and working part-time to raise support, and we were dirt poor. And when you're dirt poor, we're back on those things at the middle about work your land and diligence and handle your responsibilities. And man, I was working hard in this area. And in 1976, we had a presidential election. And I was kind of torn on who to vote for. And what I ended up deciding to do was I voted for the man that it seemed to me at the time was a devout Christian, and is probably one of the kindest, nicest men that has ever run for office anywhere, certainly in my lifetime. But what, in my opinion, this particular man did not have was wisdom and understanding about how human nature functions and about how economics works and about how the government can either make this harder or more difficult. And over the next few years, I learned a new term that had escaped me in college, the misery index. And the misery index turned out to be three things. It turned out to be high unemployment rate, and it turned out to be high interest rates. Would you buy a house if the interest rate at the bank was 11.5% for a 30-year note? Would you buy a car if the interest rate for a car was 14%? The economy went in the tank. And then, if those two things weren't enough, inflation hit. And the misery index was to take these three numbers and put them together. And I remember that generally speaking, we hovered around 25% for the total of those three together. Interest, unemployment, and inflation. Some of you are old enough to remember this time. It was a terrible time, not just economically, though it was, but for people. It had an effect on people. It had an effect on business. It had an effect on employment as employment went up, and on the ability to provide for your own families. It's not enough when it comes to work, economy, and government to foster or to talk about the ideals of concern and care and for people. The question has to be, a greater question is, what is wise? And is there understanding about how these things function together? That is the great challenge. When I think about this, I think about what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, about worldly wisdom as opposed to God's wisdom. And worldly wisdom, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:25, the foolishness of God is wiser than the worldliness of wisdom, the world's wisdom. And this has always been true, and it's still true even today. Let's pray together. Father, we do ask you for wisdom. We dare not settle for worldly wisdom, for high-sounding rhetoric and talk and ideals that are where we don't think about the impact of these things and how they affect real people. We need this in our personal life. We need to function this way as fathers and mothers and husbands and wives, as single people, as roommates. We need to function with wisdom and understanding in our work world and with our finances, but also as we think about the role that government plays. How do these three things interplay in a way that provides, that's fueled by wisdom and understanding, that fuels blessing and allows us to accomplish our stewardship? Help us to see wisely. Help us not to be like the people in 1 Samuel who just had it in their mind how things ought to be and just clamored to have that, even at great cost and misery to them.